1943. The European skies were a hunting ground. Each dawn over England saw hundreds of American crews climbing into their B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators. They were mostly young, barely out of their teens, farm boys from Iowa, factory hands from Detroit, college students from California, bundled into heavy flight suits to fight the brutal cold at 25,000 feet. They carried talismans, family photos, whispered prayers, and the terrible knowledge of the odds. Briefing rooms filled while it was still dark. Maps marked the day's objective. Another factory deep inside Germany, another oil works, another rail hub. Intelligence officers outlined the defenses they would face, the number of fighter squadrons, the flak batteries, the predicted casualties. Crews listened with stone faces while their fingers tightened on coffee cups. Day after day, the bomber streams thundered toward German industry. Day after day, dozens failed to return. Survivors told the same nightmare. Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf FW-190s swarmed like enraged hornets, slicing through formations with cannons roaring. Attacks came in waves, head-ons for the cockpit, beam attacks from the side, tail-ins from behind. Gunners replied in a frantic hail of 50-caliber rounds, but German pilots were seasoned, precise, and ruthless, pressing in close enough to see faces behind canopies. Some launched rockets into the boxes, others aimed for engines, knowing one well-placed burst could set a bomber ablaze. Then there was the flak, anti-aircraft shells bursting into deadly black bouquets that could shear an aircraft apart. German crews had years of practice. They knew bomber altitudes and speeds, how to lead a target. Their bursts detonated at just the right height, sending shrapnel every which way. A bomber holding steady on its bomb run was a perfect target. Crews heard shrapnel pinging like hail on tin. Sometimes a shard tore through the fuselage and missed a man's head by inches. Sometimes it did not miss. Each bomber carried 10 men, pilot and co-pilot shoulder to shoulder in the cockpit, wrestling the heavy controls through flak and fighter onslaughts. A navigator bent over charts and instruments plotting a way home. A bombardier lying prone in the nose, guiding the plane through the most perilous minutes of the mission. A flight engineer who doubled on the top turret. A radio operator who maintained contact and manned a defensive gun. A ball turret gunner curled in his tiny sphere beneath the belly, spinning to track attackers from below. 2 waist gunners firing through open windows in brutal cold. And a tail gunner stationed alone at the rear, the most exposed post of all. They lived and fought as a unit, trusting one another with their lives, and too often they died together. When a bomber went down, it usually took all 10 with it. A few escaped by bailing out and, if fortune favored them, became prisoners of war. Others were shot while parachuting or captured and killed by enraged civilians. Most never left the aircraft at all. The losses were almost unfathomable. During October 1943, the period later called Black Week, the 8th Air Force lost 148 bombers in 7 days. October 8 to 14, strikes on Bremen, Anklam, Marienburg, Münster, and the second Schweinfurt raid on October 14th, Black Thursday. On that day alone, 60 B-17s were shot down in combat, and 17 more so badly damaged they never flew again. Some 600 men lost in a single mission. For the week, the total reached 148 bombers destroyed, nearly 13% of the attacking force, and roughly 1,500 airmen killed, wounded, missing, or captured. 1,500 families received the dreaded telegram. "We regret to inform you." 1,500 empty places at dinner tables back home. 1,500 young men who would never reach their 25th birthday. And that was only 1 week. Most bomber crews had a life expectancy measured in missions, roughly 11 sorties. yet they were required to fly 25 to complete a tour and go home. Do the math. With an 11-mission expectancy and a 25-mission requirement, only about 1 in 4 crews would statistically survive to finish their tour. Some beat the odds through skill or luck. Many did not. The empty bunks in the barracks told the story more plainly than any statistic. Each morning, crews marched to the flight line. By afternoon, some would not return, their bunks sitting cold that night until new men moved in the next day. Personal effects were packed and shipped home. Watches, letters, photographs, a teddy bear once kept by a pilot for luck. All sent to families still hoping and praying, not yet knowing the fate of their son, husband, or brother. The casualty lists lengthened week by week. The high command knew a fix was urgent. Bombers were being shredded faster than factories could replace them. Assembly lines at home were churning out new B-17s by the hour, but production could not keep pace with the deaths. The answer wasn't simple. You couldn't simply plate the aircraft in armor. Every extra pound fought against performance. Bombers were already pushing the limits of 1940s engineering. The 4 Wright Cyclone engines on a B-17 produced about 1/200 horsepower each. Impressive, but finite. Every pound of armor reduced bomb load, fuel, or ammunition. Too much weight meant the bomber couldn't reach operational altitude and would be a sitting duck for fighters. It could lack the range to reach targets and return, forcing ditching in the Channel or crash landing in occupied France. Add armor in the wrong places, and the plane might not even lift off with a full bomb load. Engines would groan, wings fail to generate enough lift, and runways would be exhausted before the aircraft could climb. But too little protection meant the slaughter would continue. More young men dying daily, more bombers trailing black smoke across Europe, more missions shattered as formations were ripped apart by increasingly effective German defenses. The balance was vital. Somewhere there had to be an optimal amount and placement of armor that would save lives without crippling the bomber's mission. Someone had to figure out where the planes were being hit and armor those spots. Protect the vulnerable spots. Or so they thought. The military had the best engineers in the country working on this. They had combat veterans who had flown the missions. They had designers who knew every rivet and bolt in these aircraft, and they all came to the same conclusion. It was obvious where the armor should go. At Columbia University in Manhattan, just blocks from where the city's energy hummed with wartime urgency. A secret group of mathematicians and statisticians were fighting the war with equations instead of bullets. They called it the Statistical Research Group, the SRG, and these were not ordinary academics. This was arguably the most brilliant collection of mathematical minds ever assembled in one place. 18 researchers, each a specialist in their field. Each brought skills that would prove essential. The atmosphere was unlike anything in peacetime academia. There was urgency. Every problem they solved could save lives. Every delay could mean more deaths. Brilliant minds challenged each other daily, across tables covered with data. Chalkboards filled with equations that looked like abstract art to outsiders, but were tools of war to these men. Arguments erupted over statistical methods, not with personal animosity, but with the passion of people who knew the stakes. Coffee flowed endlessly. Researchers worked late into the night, sometimes sleeping in their offices. This was not the ivory tower of peacetime academia, where problems could wait for publication next year. This was war work, urgent, vital, classified. Papers were stamped secret before being locked in safes. Visitors needed security clearance. The work could not leave the building. Future Nobel Prize winners worked side by side with the founders of modern statistics. Names like Milton Friedman, who joined as associate director in 1943 and would later revolutionize economic theory. Harold Hotelling, one of the 3 charter members who helped establish the group, already a legend in mathematical statistics, W. Allen Wallace, who directed the daily research operations and kept the work focused on practical military problems. And working alongside these luminaries was a quiet refugee from Austria who had escaped the Nazis by the narrowest of margins. A man who thought differently, who saw patterns others missed, who asked questions others never thought to ask. His name was Abraham Wald. The SRG was part of the Applied Mathematics panel supported by the National Defense Research Committee. America was throwing everything it had at winning this war, including its intellectual firepower. The SRG worked on hundreds of problems across all branches of military operations: optimal pursuit curves for torpedoes, quality control for rocket fuel, sequential testing for ammunition. The work was diverse, technical, and critically important. Born on October 31, 1902 in Kolossa, Transylvania, then part of the Kingdom of Hungary, Abraham Wald grew up in a world of multiple cultures and languages. The city, now called Cluj and part of Romania, was a melting pot where Hungarians, Romanians, Germans, and Jews all lived together. Multiple languages filled the streets. Markets bustled with traders speaking different tongues. It was a rich cultural environment. But Wald's family was defined by something more important than language or culture. They were deeply religious Orthodox Jews who followed the commandments strictly and lived by principles that set them apart. One of those commandments is keeping the Sabbath. From Friday evening when the first stars appear to Saturday evening when 3 stars can be seen, no work is permitted. No writing, no traveling, no cooking. And in the Orthodox interpretation that the Wald family followed, this includes attending school. The Hungarian school system had no flexibility on this point. Classes were held 6 days a week, including Saturdays. There was no exception for religious observance, no accommodation for Jewish students who wanted to honor the Sabbath. The government saw no reason to adjust for religious minorities, so Wald's parents faced an impossible choice: violate their religious principles and send their son to school on Saturday, compromising the beliefs that defined their family, or keep him home and educate him themselves, knowing that homeschooling was risky and uncertain. They chose the latter. They chose their faith over convenience. Abraham Wald was homeschooled by his parents and older siblings from early childhood, all the way until he was ready for university. This could have been a disaster. Homeschooling in the early 1900s, without modern resources or curricular or support networks, was a tremendous gamble. Many homeschooled children fell far behind their peers. Some never caught up. But Wald's parents were not ordinary people, and they did not give their son an ordinary education. His father and older siblings gave him a rigorous, demanding education that would have challenged students in the best schools. Mathematics, where young Abraham showed immediate talent and fascination. Science is taught with whatever books and equipment they could obtain. Languages essential in their multilingual city. Philosophy and logic training his mind to think clearly and argue precisely. Religious studies maintaining their traditions. The education was intense, focused, and tailored to one brilliant student who absorbed everything they taught him. By the time he was ready for university, Wald had not just kept pace with formerly schooled students. He had surpassed them. He had mastered material that most students struggled with. More importantly, he had learned to learn independently, to solve problems without a teacher guiding every step, to think for himself. These skills would prove more valuable than any conventional schooling could have provided. In 1923, at age 20, Wald enrolled at King Ferdinand, the first university in Cluj to study mathematics. The university recognized his preparation immediately. He excelled in every course. He graduated in 1928 with distinction. Then he made the decision that would shape his career. He moved to Vienna, the intellectual capital of Central Europe, to pursue his doctorate. He studied at the University of Vienna under the supervision of Carl Manga himself, a legendary mathematician who was pioneering new fields. Wald earned his doctorate in 1931 with a dissertation on geometry that showed remarkable originality. He was 28 years old. He was brilliant, creative, capable of seeing connections others missed. Any university in Europe would have been fortunate to have him on their faculty. He should have had offers from multiple institutions competing for his talents. But this was Vienna in the 1930s. This was Europe sliding toward catastrophe. Anti-Semitism was rising across the continent like a dark tide. Jewish scholars, no matter how talented or accomplished, faced systematic barriers to academic positions. Universities had quotas limiting Jewish faculty. Departments openly refused to hire Jews. The old academic establishment saw Jews as outsiders, as threats, as unworthy regardless of their abilities. Abraham Wald, despite his doctorate, despite his brilliance, despite his promise, could not get a university appointment. He applied. He was rejected. He applied again, rejected again. Not because his work was inadequate, because he was Jewish. So instead of teaching and researching at a university, he worked as a mathematics tutor to Carl Schlesinger, a wealthy banker. It was steady work. It paid reasonably well, but it was a waste of extraordinary talent. Later, Oscar Morgenstern, director of the Austrian Institute for Business Cycle Research, recognized Wald's abilities and created an economics position for him. This was not charity. Morgenstern knew talent when he saw it. Wald began applying his mathematical skills to economic problems, bringing the same rigor and creativity to a new field that he had brought to geometry. He was making contributions, publishing papers, building a reputation among economists, but he was still shut out of academia proper, still unable to get the university position his abilities deserved. Then came March 1938, the Angelus, the annexation, the catastrophe that Austrian Jews had feared but hoped might never come. Nazi Germany, emboldened by years of conquest and expansion, turned its attention to Austria. German troops crossed the border on the morning of March 12th. They met no resistance. Many Austrians welcomed them with cheers and Nazi salutes. The formal annexation law was signed March 13th. Austria ceased to exist as an independent nation. It became part of the German Reich. For Austria's Jews, this was not a political change. This was existential threat. The Nazis immediately began implementing their racial laws with enthusiastic support from many Austrians. Jewish professionals were fired from their jobs within days. Jewish businesses were confiscated or destroyed. Jewish people were beaten in the streets by mobs, while police stood by watching or participating. Synagogues were vandalized. The persecution that had taken years in Germany happened in Austria in weeks. Abraham Wald saw what was coming, understood that this was not temporary, that this would get worse, not better, that staying meant death or imprisonment at best. That summer 1938, just months after the Annales, he fled Austria for America. He left behind almost everything: his home, his work, his professional network. Most devastating of all, he left behind his parents, his siblings, most of his extended family. They could not all get visas. They could not all escape. Someone had to stay behind. He promised to send for them when he could. He promised to get them out. He never saw most of them again. All but one of the 9 family members who remained in Austria would die in Auschwitz. His parents, his siblings, people he loved. People who had educated him and shaped him and believed in him, gone into the machinery of genocide. And Abraham Wald, safe in America, would carry that survivor's guilt for the rest of his life. In 1938, Wald was invited by the Cowes Commission for Research in Economics, then located in Colorado Springs, Colorado. He briefly served ASA Research Fellow there. By September 1938, he had moved to Columbia University in New York as a Carnegie Corporation Fellow under Harold Hotelling. This was Wald's home for the rest of his career. He became an associate professor, then a full professor. He joined the faculty permanently. He was finally, after years of discrimination and displacement, where he belonged, teaching, researching, creating new mathematics. When World War II began, America mobilized not just its factories and armies, but its minds. The Statistical Research Group was established at Columbia University, with charter members formally recognized July 1, 1942. It operated through 1945-18. Researchers worked there, supported by approximately 30 young women who handled the computing work, mostly mathematics graduates from Hunter and Vaasa colleges. The SRG tackled problems that could save lives, and one of the most urgent was the bomber problem. Allied bombers were being destroyed at an unsustainable rate. The military needed to know where to add armor. The question seemed simple. Where are the planes getting hit? Armor those spots. Engineers examined hundreds of bombers returning from missions over Europe. They met each bomber as it landed. Before the crews could even debrief, technical crews swarmed over the aircraft with clipboards and cameras. They carefully documented every bullet hole, every piece of shrapnel damage, every torn piece of aluminum, every damaged system. They measured the holes. They recorded the locations precisely. They photographed the damage from multiple angles. Back at headquarters, they compiled this data into detailed diagrams. Silhouettes of B-17s and B-24s covered with dots representing damage. Each dot marked where a bullet or piece of shrapnel had struck. After examining hundreds of aircraft, patterns emerged clearly. The data was consistent across different bomb groups, different targets, different missions. The fuselage showed heavy damage, holes everywhere, some small from machine gun fire, some large from cannon shells. The wings showed heavy damage, particularly the areas near the fuselage. The control surfaces, the ailerons and elevators were often peppered with holes. The tail sections showed heavy damage. Both the vertical stabilizer and the horizontal stabilizers had taken beating after beating, but the engines relatively little damage. Oh, there were some hits, but far fewer than the fuselage or wings. The data was clear on this point. The cockpit, not much damage either. Some hits, but nothing like what the fuselage sustained. The fuel systems surprisingly clean. The fuel tanks showed less damage than expected. The engineers compiled their statistics. They created bar charts and diagrams. They calculated the percentage of returning aircraft with damage to each area. The fuselage, wings, and tail topped the charts. The engines, cockpit, and fuel systems were at the bottom. The conclusion seemed obvious, completely, utterly obvious. Add armor to the parts taking the most hits. Reinforce the fuselage where the majority of damage occurred. Strengthen the wings that were getting torn up by fighters. Protect the tail section that showed consistent damage. These were the vulnerable areas. The data showed it clearly. Any engineer looking at the numbers would reach the same conclusion. The proposal went to the Statistical Research Group for analysis. This was standard procedure. Let the statisticians verify the numbers. Confirm the conclusion, then implement the solution. It should have been routine. A few days of numbering, then approval, then production. But Abraham Wald looked at the data and saw something no one else saw. He sat in a room with engineers and military officers and other statisticians from the SRG. They spread the diagrams across the table. Silhouettes of bombers covered with dots marking damage. Everyone in the room was looking at the same data. Everyone in the room was seeing the same patterns. Everyone except Wald. He looked at the diagrams for a long time. He asked questions about how the data was collected, about which planes were being examined, about the methodology. And then he asked a question so simple yet so profound that it changed everything. A question that should have been obvious but somehow had not occurred to anyone else. Where are the planes with engine damage? The question hung in the air. The other men in the room looked at each other. What did he mean? The data clearly showed that engines had less damage. That was right there in the numbers. Everyone could see it. But Wald pushed further. These diagrams show only the planes that came back. What about the planes that did not come back? Where were they hit? Everyone else looked at the returning planes and saw damage patterns that showed vulnerability. Wald looked at the returning planes and saw a selection bias. An enormous glaring selection bias that everyone had missed. These were the survivors. These were the lucky ones. These were the planes that made it home despite being damaged. What about the planes that did not make it home? Where were they hit? What killed them? The engineers were analyzing a biased sample without realizing it. They were only studying planes that survived combat and made it back to England. The planes that got shot down were not available for study. Those planes were scattered across Europe, crashed in German fields, burning in French forests, sunk in the English Channel, blown apart at altitude. Their damage patterns could not be documented. Their crews could not report what hit them. Their data was missing, gone, lost, and that missing data was the most important data of all. Wald realized something crucial about how the data was collected. If the returning planes showed heavy damage to the fuselage, wings, and tail, that meant something very specific. It meant these areas could absorb significant damage and still allow the plane to fly home. A bomber could take dozens of holes through the fuselage and keep flying. The crew might be terrified. There might be wounded men bleeding in the back, but the aircraft remained controllable. The engines kept running. The pilots could still fly it. Holes in the wings, serious, but not always fatal. The wings on a B-7 were massive structures with multiple spars and ribs. You could punch a lot of holes through them before the wing failed structurally. The planes were survivable with hits to those areas. That was what the data was actually telling them. Not that these areas were vulnerable and needed protection, but that these areas could take damage without bringing the plane down, but the engines showed little damage on returning of planes. Why? Not because the engines were less likely to be hit. Wald assumed on good evidence, confirmed by combat analysis, that German fighters and flak aimed at the entire aircraft. Hits in combat were distributed fairly randomly across the bomber. There was no reason to think engines were magically protected or harder to hit. They were big, obvious targets hanging off the wings. Fighters specifically aimed for them. Flak exploded near them. So why did returning planes show so little engine damage? The answer was chilling. The engines showed little damage on returning planes because planes hit in the engines did not return. They went down. A hit to an engine could start a fire that could not be extinguished. High-octane aviation fuel fed the flames. The fire spread. The engine broke apart, pieces flying off, maybe damaging the wing or starting more fires. Or the hit destroyed the engine outright, stopping it instantly. With own engine gone, the pilot could maybe limp home if they were close. With two engines gone on the same wing, the plane became uncontrollable. It rolled over and dove into the ground. The same logic applied to the cockpit. Few returning planes showed damage to the cockpit area. Not because it was a small or protected target. The cockpit was right up front, where fighters loved to make head-on attacks. The entire nose of the bomber was glazed with clear panels. Fighters could see the pilots sitting there. They aimed for them, specifically trying to kill the crew that controlled the aircraft. So why did returning planes show limited cockpit damage? Because when the cockpit took a direct hit, when bullets ripped through and killed the pilot and co-pilot, or wounded them so badly they could not fly, the plane did not come home. It crashed. The crew died. The fuel system showed the same pattern. The fuel tanks held hundreds of gallons of high-octane aviation fuel. One tracer round, one incendiary shell, one piece of hot shrapnel hitting a fuel tank could turn the entire bomber into a flying torch. Crews called it cooking off. The plane would light up, flames spreading instantly through the fuel vapor. The crew had seconds to bail out if they were lucky. Most were not lucky, so planes with severe fuel system damage did not make it back to England. They burned over Germany or limped part way and crashed in the Channel. The absence of engine damage on surviving planes was not evidence that engines were safe. It was evidence that engine damage was fatal. The absence of cockpit damage on surviving planes was not evidence that cockpits were well protected. It was evidence that cockpit damage killed the crew and doomed the plane. The absence of fuel system damage on surviving planes was not evidence that fuel tanks were secure. It was evidence that damaged fuel systems led to catastrophic fires. Wald's analysis identified a profound statistical principle that would later become known as survivorship bias. When you study only survivors, you miss the most important information: the failures, the casualties, the ones who did not make it. And those missing cases often have the most to teach you. They are absent from your sample, not randomly, but for systematic reasons related to the very thing you are trying to understand. The implications were enormous, not just for bomber armor, but for how data should be analyzed in any field. Every time you collect data, you must ask yourself, what process determined which data points I can see? What selection mechanism created my sample? What am I unable to observe and why? The data you can collect is shaped by survival, by success, by whatever process filtered out the failures. And that filtering process contains crucial information. His conclusion was stark and counterintuitive. The data suggested that armor should not go on the parts with the most damage on returning planes. It should go on the parts with the least damage on returning planes: the engines, the cockpit, the fuel systems, the parts that, when hit, prevented planes from coming home at all. If a plane could survive hits to the fuselage and still fly home, the fuselage was not the critical vulnerability. But if planes hit and the engines never came home, then engines were the critical vulnerability. This was backwards from what everyone expected. It contradicted the obvious interpretation of the visible data. But Wald was right. The engineers had been about to make a catastrophic mistake. They were about to armor exactly the wrong parts of the aircraft. They would have added weight to areas that were already survivable while leaving the truly vulnerable areas unprotected. Bombers would have been heavier, able to carry less fuel and bombs, and no safer than before. More crews would have died, all because no one had thought to ask about the missing data. Wald wrote 8 technical memoranda for the SRG analyzing damage distribution on aircraft. These were not simple documents. They were severely technical, filled with equations and statistical proofs. He developed mathematical methods to estimate damage distribution for all aircraft, including the ones shot down, using only data from survivors. This required sophisticated statistical inference. He had to work backwards from biased data to infer what the complete unbiased data would look like. His papers were classified during the war for security reasons. The enemy could not know how American operational research was improving bomber survivability. The documents remained classified for decades after the war ended. They were finally declassified in the late 1970s. In 1980, the Center for Naval Analysis published Wald's complete wartime memoranda. Researchers could finally examine the original work in detail. The SRG operated under a specific policy that shaped how Wald presented his findings. They were analysts, not military commanders. Their job was to analyze data and answer the questions they were asked. They did not make explicit military recommendations about implementation. That was for military command to decide based on the analysis. So Wald's memoranda present the statistical analysis and show what the data implies, but they stop short of saying, "You must do this specific thing." The implications were clear to anyone who read them. But the final decisions belonged to the military officers who understood aircraft design, production constraints, and operational requirements. The military used Wald's statistical methods through the rest of World War II. His approach to analyzing battle damage became standard procedure. The principle he established became embedded in military operational research for decades to come. Question your sample selection. Think about the missing data. Consider what you cannot see. Ask why certain data is available and other data is not. His work was used in the Korean War when new aircraft needed armor assessment. It was used in the Vietnam War when helicopter survivability became critical. It was used every time the military had to decide how to protect aircraft, vehicles, or personnel. The methods were taught at military MIs and war colleges. Officers learned to think like Wald, to see not just the data in front of them, but the invisible data hidden by survivorship. But Wald's contribution went far beyond bomber armor. He had identified one of the most important concepts in statistics and critical thinking: survivorship bias. The systematic error that occurs when you study only successes, only survivors, only winners, and forget that the failures have information too. Perhaps the most important information. This insight applies far beyond military operations. In business, we study successful companies and read case studies about winning strategies. But we rarely examine the thousands of companies that tried identical strategies and failed. They went bankrupt. They closed. They're not here to tell their stories. We see only the survivors and draw conclusions from incomplete data. In medicine, clinical studies can suffer from survivorship bias. If you only study patients who survive to reach the hospital, you miss the most severe cases, the ones who died before arrival. This leads to underestimating the deadliness of conditions and wrong conclusions about which treatments work best. In finance, mutual funds that close due to poor performance disappear from historical comparisons. When you evaluate average mutual fund returns, you only see the funds that survived. The failures are not in the data. This inflates performance statistics and misleads investors. Abraham Wald taught us to ask the uncomfortable question: what am I not seeing? What data is missing? What failures am I ignoring because they are not here to be counted? These questions require us to imagine what is not there, to think about the invisible, to remember that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. This requires double vision. You have to look at what is in front of you and simultaneously imagine what is not there. You have to analyze the data you have while also analyzing the data you do not have. Most people cannot do this naturally. Wald could. After the war, Wald continued his groundbreaking work at Columbia. He was now recognized as one of the leading statisticians in America. His wartime work had proven the power of mathematical thinking applied to real problems. In 1947, he published a book that would transform statistics, sequential analysis. This work grew directly from his wartime research. The methodology was initially classified because of its military applications, but after the war ended, Wald refined and expanded his ideas into a complete theoretical framework. The book, published by John Y. & Sons in New York and Chapman and Hall in London, revolutionized how scientists and engineers design experiments and make decisions. Traditional statistical methods required you to decide your sample size in advance. You would test exactly 100 subjects or measure exactly 1,000 parts, then analyze all the results at once. This approach wasted resources. Sometimes you could reach a confident conclusion with far less data, but the traditional methods forced you to collect the entire predetermined sample anyway. Wald showed how you could make reliable decisions with less data by analyzing results as they came in. You could stop collecting data when you had enough evidence to make a decision with confidence. This saved time, it saved money. It saved materials, and in medical trials, it saved lives by allowing effective treatments to be identified faster and harmful treatments to be stopped sooner. The methodology he developed became standard across countless fields: medical trials testing new drugs, quality control in manufacturing, industrial testing of materials. Anywhere decisions must be made with uncertain information and the cost of data collection matters. Wald's sequential analysis changed how the work was done. By 1950, Abraham Wald had become one of the most respected statisticians in the world. He had transformed multiple fields. He had trained a generation of students who would carry his methods forward. He had proven that pure mathematical thinking could solve real-world problems and save lives. That year, the Indian government invited him to lecture on statistics. Wald was scheduled to address the Indian Science Congress in Bangalore and visit the Indian Statistical Institute in Kolkata. He arrived in India in November 1950 with his wife Lucille. Their two children, Betty and Robert, remained home in the United States. The trip was scheduled for a few months. Wald expected to return to Columbia in mid-February. December 13, 1950, Wald and his wife boarded an Air India flight, a Douglas C-47 registration VTCFK. 7 registration VTCFK. The plane was flying from Bombay to Trivandrum with a stop in Madras. It was a scheduled commercial flight, routine and safe. But something went wrong over southern India, near the town of Kotagiri, in the Nilgiri Mountains. The plane flew into the side of a mountain. Navigation error. The pilots did not see the terrain until too late. The aircraft crashed in a rocky valley below Rangwami Peak, approximately 80 meters from Kotri at 6,000 ft elevation. All 21 people aboard died instantly. 17 passengers, 4 crew. The wreckage was not found for a week. The terrain was so difficult that bodies could not be removed. They were laid to rest at the crash site. Abraham Wald was 48 years old. The loss was devastating to the mathematical community. Obituaries appeared in leading journals worldwide. His colleague Oscar Morgenstern wrote a tribute in Econometrica. The Indian Statistical Institute held a memorial service. Columbia University mourned one of its brightest minds. His legacy, though, would prove immortal. His papers from World War II continued to influence military strategy for decades. Every time the military had to make decisions about armoring vehicles or aircraft, they consulted Wald's work. His methods were taught at military academies and war colleges. His concept of survivorship bias became one of the most important ideas in statistics, decision theory, and critical thinking. It is now a standard topic in statistics, education, business schools, medical training, and social sciences. Everywhere, people need to understand how biased samples can lead them astray. Today, more than 70 years after Wald did his analysis, survivorship bias affects how we understand success and failure across countless domains. When we study winners, we must remember the losers who are not there to study. When we analyze survivors, we must think about those who did not survive. When we see data, we must ask what data is missing. In business, survivorship bias creates a completely false picture of what strategies work. We study successful companies and read case studies about their brilliant decisions. We learn from CEOs who took bold risks and won big. But for every CEO whose risk-taking led to billions, there were dozens whose identical risk-taking led to bankruptcy. Those failed CEOs do not write memoirs. They do not give speeches. Their companies are gone. They are the missing planes. And because we only study the survivors, we conclude that their strategies must work, never realizing that survivorship bias is hiding all the failures. In medicine, clinical studies that only examine patients who survive to reach the hospital miss the most severe cases. The patients who died before arrival are not in the data. This leads to consistently underestimating how severe conditions really are and reaching incorrect conclusions about which treatments are most effective. Hospital-based studies only capture a biased sample, the survivors. Just as Wald's engineers examined only the returning bombers, in finance, mutual funds that close due to poor performance vanish from historical comparisons. When you calculate average fund returns, you only see those that survived. The failures are gone. This skews performance statistics upward by roughly 1 to 2% per year. Compounded over decades, that can make a tremendous difference in retirement outcomes. Every success story conceals countless failures. Every survivor represents many who did not make it. Every visible data point exists alongside innumerable unseen ones. Wald taught a mindset that goes beyond bomber armor. He taught us to scrutinize our samples, to ask whether what we observe is truly representative or biased, to account for selection effects, to consider the processes that produce the data we have and what those processes might be concealing. In 1943, young airmen climbed into their bombers every morning, uncertain if they would see another sunset. The military examined the bullet holes and assumed obvious solutions. They focused on damaged fuselages, wings, and tails. The data appeared straightforward. The conclusion seemed self-evident. They were on the verge of reinforcing precisely the wrong parts of the aircraft. But Abraham Wald looked at the same information and saw something entirely different. He saw the planes that weren't there. He noticed the missing bullet holes. He detected the hidden truth lying in plain sight. He asked the question no one else considered. Where are the planes with engine damage? Why don't we see them? What does their absence reveal? It was not luck. It was disciplined reasoning, rigorous mathematics applied with insight and creativity. It was the courage to question assumptions everyone else accepted. By looking beyond the obvious, by challenging common beliefs, by analyzing what was missing rather than only what was present. Wald's insight helped safeguard American airmen, not with superior weapons, not with new tactics, but through clear, methodical thinking, by asking the right question. That is Abraham Wald's legacy. Not merely his extraordinary mathematical talent, nor solely his groundbreaking contributions to statistics and operational research, but his enduring lesson: to notice what is not visible. To understand that the most critical data is often the data we cannot observe, that the most valuable lessons come from the failures that never survived to teach us. In a room of brilliant thinkers, Wald was the one who asked the different question. He saw beyond the obvious. He was the mathematician who noticed what everyone else overlooked. And in recognizing it, that singular insight about missing data and survivorship bias, he transformed how we interpret evidence. He provided a tool to prevent systematic reasoning errors. He showed that sometimes the most important presence in the room is the thing that is absent. The bullet holes were on the planes that returned, but the true lesson, profound and enduring, lay with the planes that did not. In the missing data, in the invisible evidence. Abraham Wald taught us to search for the absent planes, to question what is not visible, to perceive the unseen. And that lesson continues to save lives more than 70 years later.